Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. Israel has announced that it will expropriate 1,000 acres of Palestinian land for a new settlement near Bethlehem. It's the largest land grab in 30 years, and even the United States has condemned it. Sarah Say has more on this story.
Israel yesterday announced that it would expropriate nearly 1,000 acres of Palestinian land, angering Palestinians and alarming Israeli peace campaigners. This would be the biggest land appropriation in 30 years. The land near Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank has been declared state land and could be used to build homes for Jewish settlers. A local Palestinian mayor said that Palestinians own the land and harvested olive trees on them.
يعني احنا تفاجأنا منذ ساعات صباح هذا اليوم قامت الإدارة المدنية الإسرائيلية والجيش الإسرائيلي بتوزيع إخطارات وتركيب أرمات في مناطق عديدة من أراضي قرية واد فوكين في مناطق شمال وجنوب وغرب القرية مما يشير إلى مصادرة آلاف الدنومات لصالح توسع 3 مستوطنات رئيسية تحيط بالقرية.
Although the notice published by the military has given no reason for the decision, Israel Radio has reported that the step was taken in response to the kidnapping and killing of 3 Jewish teens, which Israel accused Hamas of having carried out in the area in June. But the timing of the move is likely to be seen as direct provocation by the Israelis, coming just 1 week after a fragile peace deal was signed with the Palestinians, following the assault on Gaza, which saw over 2,000 people killed. Peace Now, which opposes Israeli settlement activities in the West Bank, said that the appropriation was meant to turn a site where 10 families now live adjacent to a Jewish seminary into a permanent settlement.
This new declaration of expansion of settlements by the Israeli government is very significant. We don't remember such a big announcements in the last 1 or 2 decades. This is a stab in the back of Abbas and the moderate people in the Palestinian Authority. Instead of strengthening the Palestinian Authority versus Hamas, Israel is showing its other side and actually in a unilateral move expand settlements activity and destroy the chance for renegotiation with the Palestinian Authority.
The intended construction of a major settlement at the location known as Gaviot has been put on hold by Israel since 2000. But last year, the government invited bids for the building of 1,000 housing units at the site. Anyone with ownership claims have 45 days to make an appeal. Israel says construction at Gaviot would not constitute the establishment of new settlements because the site is officially designated a neighbourhood of Eilon Shavot, an existing settlement several kilometres down the road. This is not the first time that Israel has come under intense international criticism over its settlement activities. Most countries regard the settlements as illegal under international law and a major obstacle to the creation of a viable Palestinian state in any future peace deal. Sarah Say, The Report.
Well, with me in the studio to discuss some of what we saw is Abe Hayeem, who's founder and chair of Architects and Planners for Justice in Palestine, and journalist Ben White. So, Ben, is this a provocation coming so soon after the end of the recent conflict?
I think it's probably as likely to be a response by Netanyahu to the far-right extremists within the Israeli government and within the public more broadly, who have felt very unsatisfied with what happened with the attack on Gaza, who felt that the Israeli military actually didn't go far enough, who felt like that it was a disgrace that Hamas was left standing, etc., after the end of the operation. And that this sort of announcement is welcomed by them. We've had comments by Naftali Bennett and other members of the government welcoming the decision to expropriate the land. So I think it's probably a move by Netanyahu to appease those members of the government. But of course, remembering that expropriations or settlement construction has continued apace anyway over the last months and years.
Is that how you read it, that it's part of internal dissension inside the Israeli cabinet?
Well, it's to do with everything, really, because it's part of the whole land grab policy of the Israeli government, which has never ended. This has been the continuous process. And they use any excuse, to set off something that had already been planned, as it was, since 2000. They say that this was a sort of price tag, for the killing of the 3 settler youth in the West Bank, but that's an absurd way of saying, if somebody gets murdered somewhere, some other part of the community, gets punished for it.
Because if we were working on that basis, the Palestinians would have the whole of the Palestine back by now.
Exactly, and the whole issue is rife with complete illegality and criminality, because this is a war crime on any level. Building settlements are war crimes. And as an architect, from an architect's point of view, the architects who build them are also contravening, their own ethical codes of conduct. And so the issue is there is never any pressure from world governments, to stop Israel's criminality. And even the Americans have just called it counterproductive. Instead of saying, look, for heaven's sake, this is illegal, stop it. Everything is illegal. The grabbing of land in East Jerusalem, which has been illegally annexed, which Israel assumes, it can sort of just continue expanding, exponentially. So from any level, it's illegal, it's criminal, and it's unacceptable.
When this happens, in the report we heard there's 45 days for appeal. Is that entirely meaningless, or can such an appeal hold up the process at all?
Well, unfortunately, the Israeli courts, which the sort of Israel lobby says, is a wonderful example of Israel's justice, never really gives justice to the Palestinians, and inevitably, almost inevitably, fall on the sides of the settlers, the illegal settlers, and the civil administration, which in itself is an army-based law, that governs the occupied territories. So usually the whole legal system is totally biased against the Palestinians, and they never really stand a chance. But of course, in terms of legality, this is Palestinian village land, which is desperately needed for their own expansion. And this is used, to block the contiguity of Palestinian land, in the occupied territories, and make sure that Israel, holds that land, in perpetuity.
Ben, what of the point that was made in the report there by the Peace Now spokesperson, who said that this is a stab in the back for the Fatah part of the government, and that it's damaging to them and strengthens Hamas's hand?
We have to remember that before the attack on Gaza and before the events of the summer, the context was a comatose peace process. The context was continued Israeli settlement expansion and violations of international law. Israel didn't fulfill the full prisoner release. So there were these obstacles that were preventing even someone like Mahmoud Abbas going back to the negotiating table. And now with the Gaza operation concluded, I think you can think about how Netanyahu will be looking at the situation more generally, knows that there will be international pressure, but actually wants to thwart any meaningful progress, even towards the sort of US-led US-led negotiations with Abbas. And something like this means that Saeb Erekat and Mahmoud Abbas can't bring themselves to return to a negotiating table, at least in the short term, when the Israeli government is doing things like expanding settlements and expropriating land.
I mean, whether or not you thought that a two-state solution was a viable solution or not, as a political process now, it probably looks more damaged than it has ever done, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's, you see the comments by people like the UK government today, who used quite strong language to say they deplore the expropriation of land. They talked about how this would damage Israel's standing in the international community. And they made the sort of, by now, obligatory reference to the fact that they hope for a return to negotiations and a two-state solution. But these sorts of comments and pleas by the UK government, by the EU, by the US, are sounding increasingly feeble and vacuous, because in the absence of any sort of accountability for Israeli violation of international law, when Israel knows that it can just continue to do and commit these expansions without any sort of consequences for these actions, then even that two-state solution is unlikely to materialise.
I mean, Kerry was saying before this conflict that it was the kind of last chance for that solution. Now, I mean, the Americans can't and won't give up on the Israelis, but do you think that there's sort of greater tension in that relationship than there was before?
I think there's sounds of tension, but I think the intention of Obama, whom I think is an absolute disgrace, is really to just allow the thing, to drag on and to literally do nothing. And using this whole issue of the Islamic State, the Islamophobia, the threat, the Islamic threat as an excuse to allow Israel, to continue to remain, the sort of outpost of, the West in the heart of the Middle East. So I think it's very unlikely that they will do anything about it. But this is where, in fact, the whole BDS movement comes in, the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, because now more than ever, it seems to be the only way, that Israel can be brought to its senses, or at least suffer some of the consequences, because up to now it has never suffered any of these consequences. But I think now, since Gaza, which in itself was a red line, what Israel is now planning is to go hell for leather, to literally do whatever it likes, use, the most extreme measures of arrest, detention, imprisonment, killings of Palestinians, to just literally, continue the suppression and oppression of the Palestinian people and hold them, in almost, total enslavement. So I think it's really due, the Western government have got to be pressured in every respect possible. And of course, BDS has got to be applied in absolutely determined way.
Ben, how do you read the current state of the US-Israeli relations now? Do you think the outcome of the recent Gaza conflict wasn't a happy one, probably the least happy one for the Israeli state in a long time? Obviously, the Americans have signalled some unhappiness with this. Is it under strain?
I think you've got, maybe a bit crudely, but you can say the two levels of the political sphere and the more civil society sphere. On the political level, there were some tensions that don't normally exist. Those were tensions that were exhibited in public on both sides, from the Israeli government and from the US side. Obviously, there was the normal, almost blanket support for Israel on Capitol Hill. But within the White House, within the State Department, there were definite noises of disquiet and sort of unhappiness, I think, with the fact that their strongest ally in the region was visibly and very publicly killing so many civilians, including, of course, hundreds of children in the Gaza Strip. Now, on the level of civil society, you did see interesting developments in terms of the opinion polls that showed these particularly generational shifts amongst Americans, with more sympathy being displayed for Palestinians than before, and unhappiness with Israel's policies in the Gaza Strip. You saw the issue of celebrities tweeting their sort of support for Gaza. So I think it's fair to say that in the US context specifically, the events of the summer have marked a sort of, maybe not a watershed, but a moment along the way of shifts in public opinion, with the political level still sort of mainly being supportive of Israel. But they also sort of reflect the rumblings of disquiet, below them amongst sort of faith communities and amongst the younger generations and that sort of thing.
Abe, let's just come back to the whether there's a strategic importance attached to this land grab. I mean, we've said that it's large, but you were mentioning in one of your earlier comments that it actually has a sort of strategic impact on the political geography of the area. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, absolutely, because every single extension and development of the settlements has a strategic intention, which is to block off connections between one Palestinian village and another, to link up with Jerusalem, which is expanding, to greater Jerusalem, which was almost up to the, Jericho, in fact, because Ma'ale Adumim, which is its most eastern, western extent, has areas in between that Israel needs to fill in, so that it blocks off all the Palestinian villages, steals their land, to prevent their development. So it prevents the sort of desperate need, that the Palestinians have for their agriculture, which is Wadi Fukin, for instance, which is one of the villages, was an idyllic area of Palestinian agriculture in a valley, almost, very beautiful, which settlements were sort of draining their sewage out into this area. And what Israel needs is not only land for development, for housing for settlers, but also they're sort of taking over, appropriating agricultural land as well. So it destroys the Palestinian economy, destroys their whole civic infrastructure, and literally fragments, the whole of the West Bank into sort of little archipelagos, little Bantustans, which they can then control, this whole matrix of control.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thanks to Abe and to Ben for their comments on that question. We're going to have to go for our first break of the evening now, but do join us for part two when we'll be looking at the rest of the day's news.